starter homes are disappearing from the United States. In the early 1980s, as many as 40% of the new homes built were considered entry-level. By 2023, just 9% fit the criteria.
Give it another 20 years and literally no young person will be able to afford.
Yeah, we don't have to wait 20 years for that to happen because here in New York City, it's already happening. And while the prices for entry-level homes here start at around $200,000, for most people, living in these places becomes impossible after a year or two because spending that amount of money will only get you a one-room, one-person studio in most of the city, making New York a place that's quickly running out of room for most of its residents. And the worst part about this is nobody in charge seems to care if New York's middle class disappears permanently.
Manhattan real estate sales stalled for 2 years as buyers and sellers just remained too far apart on price. Now the sellers are caving. The average apartment price in Manhattan will now cost you only $2 million.
Yeah, a starter home used to be a smaller condo, a smaller space, and someone would upgrade maybe after 5 years as they get married or have a family and want to move. But now we're actually seeing that most people are buying their first home as a single family residence.
Rents have been steadily rising in New York City in recent years, but incomes have not kept pace. Median rents in New York City rose 18%.
A new survey reveals 85% of New Yorkers say the cost of food is rising faster than their income. Nearly half of the people surveyed say it's harder to afford groceries and find themselves cutting back on healthy stuff. Meats, poultry, fish, eggs are up nearly 25%.
Just thinking about all of the headwinds that a 30-year-old may have, like student loan debt and car loans and credit card debt, and then they have rising rent. And so it's hard to save for a down payment.
So if you thought homes in America were overpriced, here it's newsworthy when something hits the market for under $1 million. And what nobody's talking about is this unaffordability crisis. It's only going to get worse in New York because it's not just the home prices here that are forcing average people to leave the city. Literally everything in this city that has a dollar sign on it costs more here than it does anywhere else. Want milk? That'll cost you almost $10 a gallon. Deodorant? Get ready to fork over $20 to not smell like the rest of the city. Speaking of smells, if you're brave enough to take the subway to work in the morning and put your life on the line, that'll cost you almost $3. All to work for a paycheck that in most cases will not cover your rent. Something 1 out of every 3 New Yorkers spend half their income on every single month, leaving folks with very few opportunities to save anything, let alone buy a place and build wealth. Something the middle class in America has traditionally done through home ownership. You start working, buy a home, and it builds equity, increases in value, and serves as your primary residence. At least that's how things are supposed to work. But here, that home you bought, it's a one-room apartment for one person only, and it could technically be a primary residence, but if you get married and your life expands in any way, you'll be forced to move out of that place faster than you can say eviction. Which is essentially what's happening to New York City's working class. They're being evicted from this city by a series of economic factors that none of our wealthy, progressive elites think are actually a big deal. High apartment prices? Who cares about that when you've got a job sitting at a desk somewhere earning hundreds of thousands in income, which you can use to buy the overpriced eggs at our supermarkets without batting an eye. And if you have no desire to ever build a family or expand your life, living in a one-room apartment isn't a big deal either, and you won't need that $800,000 two-bedroom we just saw a news article about. And as you're about to see, anybody who wants to own something that's bigger than a tiny shoebox apartment here, they're gonna need a way to get filthy rich. Look at this place, it's like a labyrinth. And if you sleep in that bedroom and you're hungry, look at that, you can make yourself a snack right here. You got the stove and the fridge all in this one spot. That's pretty good. But renting this for $3,500 a month is way cheaper than buying it for over $800,000, which is the price of that other 2-bedroom. But this is what you'd consider to be a starter home or a starter apartment. It's the right size for somebody or a couple, maybe who are starting out professionally and don't have a whole lot of stuff. And traditionally, somebody starting out in the workforce would be able to scrape together a small down payment after a few years and get something like this. But if that's no longer possible and people are paying rent their entire professional lives, that really screws up what have been the traditional ways the working class has built wealth and taken care of themselves after they retire. And certainly this dynamic of unaffordable starter homes and homes in general isn't unique to just New York. It's happening everywhere.
Starter homes are disappearing from the United States. In the early 1980s, as many as 40% of the new homes built were considered entry-level. By 2023, just 9% fit the criteria.
Give it another 20 years, and literally no young person will be able to afford to purchase a home, period.
Yeah, so in New York City, you don't really have starter homes that someone starting out would be able to afford. In fact, anything that's getting purchased around here is probably getting purchased by somebody who is already of means. And the reason that this is such a disaster is because if you're able to own what becomes your primary residence and then sell it after a while, well, it means you'll be able to recoup what is the largest expense most people have: housing. Man, this is definitely a tight sink. This might be a starter home for somebody who just became old enough to start washing their hands by themselves. Man, look at this. My arms are stuck. But you know something? Every apartment in this city is like this to an extent, and you can either rent something like this or you can way overpay to say that you own something like this. But the problem of a lack of starter homes in this country, it causes a couple of problems. The first problem, obviously, is the whole dynamic of how people build wealth through home ownership instead of paying rent. But the second problem it causes is that eventually it'll push up rental prices beyond what most people can afford. And that's where we find ourselves in this city. We've now run out of affordable homes across the rental market and the sales market. And some people say things may be past the point of no return. And if you look across the street here, you can see the obvious problem here. We aren't building new buildings. All of these tiny little buildings here, they have to be replaced by the exact same thing if they ever fall down. And even though you could triple the amount of people living in each plot here if you just allow taller buildings, New York zoning laws do not allow that. And that's why most of the real estate that you find in this city looks and feels like where we are right now. However, the lack of new construction isn't the only reason why housing prices haven't gone down to what most people can afford. Sadly, there's a much bigger monster out there that's holding many people back financially, stopping them from owning homes, and it's probably not going to change anytime soon.
The premium paid to buy a home has increased sharply relative to renting over the past decade. The increases in home prices have also outpaced increases in wages, and the median age of the typical first-time home buyer has climbed to 38. That's up from age 29 in 1981.
So people used to buy what would be considered starter homes in their 20s, but now people are buying those same homes in their 40s, essentially. Now, one recent report has the average sale price of a home in Manhattan costing $2 million, which is just an insane amount of money. Well, let's say you're able to find one for $1 million. Here, I found one. It's got terrible pictures, which are shrunken down for some reason. But look at that, $999,000. And what do you have for a monthly payment? Well, you've got a mortgage payment, which is going to be around $7,000 a month, and then maintenance fees, which include taxes, of around $1,900 a month. $9,000 a month to experience home ownership. You could rent a home and take the other $5,000 plus a month that you're saving and invest that money somewhere else and get a return on that. Home ownership almost doesn't make sense for many people in New York right now, but because of the rental prices, neither does renting, unfortunately. Now, yes, you could drastically increase the number of starter homes here if you would build more of them. However, we don't just have restrictive zoning rules. We've got another problem. Look out this window here. Look at all these buildings packed up next to each other. There isn't any vacant land or any space to build new stuff. The only way to build here is up, and we're not allowing that for some reason. I guess we still want to be able to see the sky, which of course won't be possible if you fill up all the empty space we've got here with a bunch of skyscrapers. And if you were to do that, blocking the view of everybody that owns a home right now would devalue the price of their homes, revealing that people who already own something now are totally against the idea of newcomers to the homeownership game like me or you, which has a lot to do with why there's so much opposition to new home construction or taller buildings in general. However, New York City is so much further down the doom spiral of unaffordable home prices that it should be serving as a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, for other cities that don't want to build homes either. Only it isn't able to serve in that manner for itself for some reason.
Now, new data backs it up. Rents have been steadily rising in New York City in recent years, but incomes have not kept pace. The Fiscal Policy Institute just released a report that found that median rents in New York City rose 18% between 2019 and 2023. During that same period, incomes only grew by just over 11%.
So the only way that incomes can rise slower than rents are rising is if you have a shortage of places to rent, which is where we are right now. We're actually in the worst housing crisis New York City has seen in the last 50 years. It's crazy. 1.4% of apartments are even available to be rented. And right now the average upfront costs to rent something are $13,000, an amount of money that would bankrupt most people. And what that creates is a situation where you have people who are stuck in an apartment where they might be paying too much to move, or where they might be missing out on certain aspects of life, but moving from that apartment would cost so much money that they end up staying there. And God forbid you lose your security deposit when you move. Oh man, that's an extra month of rent on top of that $13,000, and then the movers, I mean, you could be paying $20,000, revealing that everyone who rents here is a prisoner to some extent. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if renting's a bad move and if housing demand is so high, why don't I just buy every place I live in? For example, if all I can afford is a studio apartment for a couple $100,000, if I've got the money for it, I'll buy it. Well, you could technically go and do that, but the problem is a one-room apartment might not be a place that you can live in for a very long time. And statistically, if your housing needs change within 5 years and you sell within that period, you'll lose money. And this rule is known as the 5-year rule. But here's why it doesn't always apply, especially in overpriced markets like New York. This is a one-room, one-bathroom apartment. It's a studio, and it costs almost $500,000. And if you look down here, the last recorded closing was back in 2016 for around the same price, which is what it's selling for today. Whoever bought this thing 9 years ago is gonna lose money on it. And even if they sell it for the exact same price, they still have to pay the broker's commission. They have all the costs of owning it, the carrying costs. And if the home you buy here doesn't go up in value, that could blow up all of your plans for financial freedom and wealth building for sure. But losing money on your primary residence, if that's the worst thing that happens to you in New York, consider yourself lucky, because now prices are so high that even buying the things that are supposed to go in the apartment and keep you alive while you live here is becoming impossible for most people. This is crazy. $2.49 for the basic Walgreens water brand. That is crazy. But it's not just Walgreens. Every store here that sells anything has prices that are much higher than most people expect. And in fact, they're so high that many people are having problems feeding themselves. And food insecurity is a real deal here when people are also trying to pay their overpriced rents.
85% of New Yorkers say the cost of food is rising faster than their income. Nearly half of the people surveyed say it's harder to afford groceries and find themselves cutting back on healthy stuff.
You know something? This sounds just like the housing market. 85% of New Yorkers report that the costs to buy food are rising way faster than they can afford, with things like cereals and baking products being 26% more expensive than they were in 18. Milk and eggs, those are up 25%. Fruits and vegetables, those are up 17%. And astronomical grocery prices are just another way the middle class here is being squeezed and forced out of this city. Basic apartments, those cost too much. Basic foods at the grocery store, those also cost too much. Now, food prices are rising due to factors that are related to the production of the very foods we're consuming, yes, but that's not the only reason prices are high in a city like New York. You've got other issues like theft, which causes a lot of stuff to get stolen. And if people are stealing their groceries instead of paying for them, that's just gonna jack up prices. And 93% of grocers said they were shoplifted from in 2023. That's absurd. But that's not the only problem you've got in New York. You've got the high rent, you've got the high costs of labor. All of that jacks up the price that a given thing of rose oil moisturizing hand cream has to sell for. But out of control rents aren't the only problem a store like this is going to have. They've got out of control utility costs as well. Any business that uses water for any reason now has to pay more for it because of new taxes that the city charged itself and then passed along to landlords and companies like this grocery store. But it's one thing to have high rent along with a high cost for obtaining the products you want to sell in your store. At least you can account for what those are. They don't typically change on a week-by-week basis, but shoplifting, that is unpredictable. A store could be fine for a while and then it could get hit big time and massive amounts of products could get removed from the shelves. How on earth does a business fight that? Sure, they can fight it by adding the security guard that Trader Joe's has, but that costs money, and if a whole bunch of products get stolen, the only way to get that back is to raise the prices of everything that's still left on the shelves. And businesses here have it so bad already. We just talked about the theft. That's an astronomical problem. And the rents for stores like this, those are going up even higher because what theft does is it shuts down other profitable businesses in other parts of town. And the landlord that owns the place behind me right here probably has other storefronts elsewhere that are empty. And he's looking at these guys and the apartments that are upstairs, these guys right here. And what's crazy about that is most people don't realize that if their rent goes up, it's because a store that your landlord owns may have just closed and he's dividing up what he's losing between everybody who pays him rent for something else. Now, obviously, this is a massive disaster, but what is New York City to do? Should we start building taller buildings? Do we block out the sky so that people can now afford to have a roof over their heads? And what do you think about this whole idea of starter homes? Should those even be a thing in New York, or should those be built in areas of town that are inherently less expensive to build and create properties in to begin with? And lastly, what do you think about this dynamic between those who own a home and already have one and their inherent opposition to new housing construction? After all, new houses devalue the value of current houses. Let me know. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next video.